Okay, hello everyone. I hope everyone is holed up nicely and surviving the coronavirus. So, for quite a long time now, I've wanted to make a video about something called the Robbers Cave experiment. And this is one of the things that people point to say, aha, you see how terrible people are, and you see why we need, government and things like that to keep people in line. And so, for those of you who don't know about it, I'll give you the summary that everyone thinks they know, which I'll go ahead and tell you is wrong. But the basic idea is a group of psychologists took, I think, 22 kids, all from stable middle-class families, no gang members or anything like that. They all had good grades. They took them out to the park in Robbers Cave, Oklahoma, and they divided them out into two groups. And they didn't tell the two groups about each other at first, and so they were just in the park for a week. And then they made the two groups known of each other, and that's all they had to do. And then all of a sudden, the two groups were at each other's throats, and that's all you have to do to get people at each other. And of course, you can see the correlation with everyone's favorite movie, where the Lord of the Flies, where the kids are out shipwrecked, I think, and all of a sudden, they come back, years later and find that these kids have just made a complete wreck of everything. And so the idea is that even when you're working with kids and you have a tabula rasa, this is just what happens, and you automatically have people dividing out into groups and they hate each other. And that wasn't actually how it was. So when I was doing research for this, I found this article by Rutger Bregman. And the interesting thing is, well, not the interesting thing, it's just the thing, is that I couldn't find an English version of it. And I mean, I really think this article needs to get around in English. I'm looking at it through Google Translate. I think it's in Dutch. So there might be some weird phraseology because of the translation, but this was a really good article. It actually told me a lot of things I didn't know about it. I mean, I pretty much knew all the myths and why it's not the way that everyone says it was. But I mean, this guy, he really goes through and does a good job. This is what happens when you release ordinary children into the wilderness. And so he starts off talking about Lord of the Flies, which I won't get into, but, he goes through the story. He also goes through, how it was written and everything. And it was written, it started in 1951, but it took a few years to get published. And while all this was going on, the Robbers Cave experiment was happening. So I'm going to scroll down through all of this where he says, what would happen in real life? And he says, I didn't really doubt Golding's black image of man. There's something in human nature that makes us believe the worst about the same nature. What I didn't know at the time was that in 1954, not least the year that Lord of the Flies was published, a real experiment was being carried out, and that's the Robbers Cave experiment. So again, the popular version is that, hey, this totally confirms Lord of the Flies, and all these kids got set against each other. We don't have anyone in the chat room now. At least it's not showing up on my screen. If people are talking in the chat and something's gone wrong, I apologize for that. But yeah, maybe they're just all holding up. Maybe I'll switch back to the screen in a minute just to make sure no one's chatting for real. So anyway, 1954, they go out to Robbers Cave State Park for a science experiment. They don't know it's a science experiment. They just think they're going to camp. And the guy who did all this was Muzaffar Sharif. For years, he's been interested in the question of how conflict arises between groups and how peace can then be restored. And this is something that was, hey, Meme Lord, okay, good, it's working, thank you. This is something that people were really interested in following World War II because, it was just baffling what the Nazis were doing. It was just like, why? How can they even get people to do that? It's just, it is a puzzlement. So So in the first phase of the research, the two groups are not aware of each other's existence. They have the empire to themselves. What will happen the first week of total freedom? Do the boys behave like William Golding thought children would behave? Well, as he says, science is less exciting than fantasy. They got along together. That's just what they did. So, and he says they bake burgers and put up a tent. They run and jump and become close friends. There's one boy, Everett, who, like Piggy in Lord of the Flies, cannot swim, but he is not bullied. The members of his group form a protective circle in the water, after which little Everett dares to jump. He was praised by everyone, the researchers will note later, and first named by his favorite nickname. Okay, so then things start taking a dark turn. Sharif actually starts pitting the groups against each other, and the groups are called the Rattlers and the Eagles. And he said, quote, the aim of this phase was to check the conditions so that each group would see the other as a competitor. And so they, for example, they started a tournament. I mean, they did a lot of things. This article doesn't really go into it, but you can find any reference and look at all the stuff they did. But they played games that had a clear winner and loser, like baseball, tug of war. There was no consolation prize. And there was one team that won overall that got to keep all the prize money. Yeah. And so they're just manipulating them into, oh, you have to beat them. And it says the Eagles in particular are not very excited about the tournament at first. Maybe we can just make friends with these guys so no one needs to get angry or dislike anyone. But they finally get it to work, and they finally get the Eagles and the Rattlers pitted against each other, and fights break out and things like that. Well, that's generally where people stop telling the story. They don't tell you about the week that followed. The struggle, which was anything other than spontaneous, it was very much manipulated. And by the way, that wasn't the experimenters cheating. The whole idea wasn't to prove that, kids will just automatically get pitted against each other. They wanted to try and see, once you have groups that are pitted against each other, what it takes to make peace between them. That was the point. But of course, in order to do that, they needed to pit them against each other first. So, yeah, there's that whole other week that we'll go into about how they were able to get together and become friends. But this is the part I didn't know. This was the third attempt. They had tried it twice before, and it hadn't even worked. And so Sharif wrote that the previous experiment had to be aborted because of various difficulties and adverse conditions. 60 years later, the psychologist Gina Perry discovered exactly what had happened. The two groups, the Panthers and the Pythons, had become such good friends they could no longer be separated. The staff grew increasingly frustrated with the boys' goodness. One of the researchers pulled down a tent, hoping the Panthers would be blamed. To his frustration, the children helped each other rebuild the tent. The staff then raided the Panthers, hoping the Pythons would be blamed. This time, too, they came to help each other. Eventually, the children learned they were being manipulated. One of them found a notebook with detailed observations, and that was the end of that experiment. So, one participant said, I think we got to know each other well in the first few days, and it seems that if you have friends, it gets a little more difficult to really compete. That sounds like common sense, doesn't it? And also one of them said, I've started to think very differently about many things. It's very encouraging. So the people who were involved were like, well, now wait a minute. This whole thing about people automatically getting pitted against each other, that's not the way it is. The tendency is to become friends. The tendency is to want to work together and do things together. And when you compete, it's competing, in good sport. So what they found through these experiments was that in order to get groups pitted against each other, you had to convince them that they were operating in a zero-sum game and that the other group was taking more than their fair share. Like I think at one point, one of the groups got to use the picnic park first, and then when the second group came in, they had already eaten all the food, and they said, oh, well, there's no more food for you because the other group ate it all, things like that. And I mean, you can really see the parallels today, isn't it? I mean, it seems like the whole political view of economics, especially in on the left is all about the zero-sum fallacy, and there's this big piece of mind, the rich are taking more than their fair share, and that's exactly what it is. That's how you pit in-groups against out-groups. That's how you manipulate them into not being the friends that they would otherwise be, but into being at each other's throats. So he goes back to William Golding and Lord of the Flies. And he talks about things like Golding having a bad relationship with his son and stuff like that, and why he would come to this conclusion, which is not at all scientific. So, back to the Rattlers and the Eagles. In that third week, it says, the money was almost gone, but finally we managed to get the boys together. How do you turn enemies into friends? The answer would make him world famous. The researchers first tried it with fun things, having breakfast together, watching movies, swimming, lighting fireworks, to no avail. Then they confronted the children with a series of shared challenges. For example, they pretended that the camp's water supply was broken. They did a little minor bit of sabotage, and then the kids had to work together to fix it. And so the turn came when the management pretended one of the trucks was broken. The children quickly agreed the vehicle would be towed, and so they used the rope, which they had just used for the tug-of-war, to go out to get the car to work. And the boys pulled it for a couple of minutes, and one of the scientists restarted the truck, and one of the Eagles yelled out, "Yeah, we want the tug-of-war against a truck!" So that was part of it, having a common challenge to work against. And so the author says, once again I realized that little remains of Golding's image of man. Remember, in Lord of the Flies, the group went down in disaster. In Oklahoma, it brought the boys together. At the end of the week, the boys asked if they could return together on one bus. And this is the part I knew, and it's a very nice little heartwarming ending for it. When they sat on the bus, they didn't sit like Rattlers on one side and Eagles on the other. They were just kind of in between each other, just one big group of friends again. And they still had some prize money left from the tournament. The Rattlers had won the tournament, and so they asked if they could use it to buy milkshakes, not just for the Rattlers, but for all the children. Yeah. When they were almost home, the boys started to sing. They exchanged addresses and promised never to forget each other. Of course, you know how those things go, but who knows? Maybe some of them did stay in touch. But hello, Scorch. The Robbers Cave experiment was a gigantic project. It's still a milestone in social psychology to this day. Since then, more research has been published. The literature shows that we are sensitive to we-they thinking early on, especially when stimulated from above, as in the second week of Sharif's experiment. But there is also a library full of evidence that from an early age, we are full of the urge to help each other, as in the first week, and that common challenges can bring us together, as in the third week. That is to say, when life is not going well, we don't fall over each other. When disaster strikes, we grow together. Then civilization turns out not to be a thin layer, but a thick blanket that keeps us all warm. So, I really like that article, even with some weird phrasing that comes from Google Translate. It'd really be nice if there were a proper English translation. But he goes into, why is it that we think the worst about ourselves, and he talks not only about Lord of the Flies, but reality TV. And we see this, it was like MTV's The Real World, I think, that really got it kicked into high gear. It wasn't the first, but it was one of the ones where, we're showing all this conflict that happens when you stick a bunch of people together in the same house. A lot of that is manipulated. Just like the kids and the experimenters, the producers kind of egg them on to get into conflict with each other or make them suspicious of each other. So, they call it reality TV, but it's incredibly manipulated. So, the consequences of such a black image of man, well, you say, who cares? People understand that it's entertainment. And this is something that kind of drives me crazy when people make this kind of excuse. Like back when they said, when John Edward was pretending to talk to the dead and people actually believed it, they're like, well, it's just for entertainment. It's like, no. If you're watching something, even if it's a work of fiction, and you come away with a vision of reality that is false due to that work of fiction, then they've done something bad, in my opinion. This drives me crazy about Law and Order. Because, I mean, there's a lot about Law and Order that's a good show. You know, it's got good characters, good conflicts, but, I mean, it's really... Now, and I get that it's told from the point of view of the police, so you're going to see that, but it's all like, oh, the bad guy, of course, we never really arrest someone who's bad, so anyone who's innocent, you know, must be, you know, innocent because he manipulated the system or fooled the jury or whatever, and the Constitution is just a thing that gets in people's way. The problem is that's been having a real consequence in actual court cases. You know, people see something on Law and Order that says, oh, well, that means that someone's lying when it doesn't, and they assume that a witness is lying when they aren't. And that's bad. So, and psychologist Brian Gibson talks about that it is this Lord of the Flies style television that convinces people that this is how they are. And if you're led to believe that other people are like that, if you go out there in the world going, oh, well, everyone is just out for number one and they're out to get their piece of the pie, that's how you're going to react to things. If you make that assumption about other people, yeah, then you're going to react that way. And more important is the effect on our worldview. British researchers found out that girls who watch more reality TV are more likely to say you have to be mean and false to get ahead in the world. Yeah. I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, let me go down a little bit further. This is a pretty long article, so I'm not reading it all. But yeah, here's the fact that we keep coming back to, that we just can't get away from. Most people are good. And Rutger says, it's time to tell a different story. Of course, each of us has evil within us. Bullying children and adults at war. But most of the 7 billion souls on this earth are busier to live and love than to hurt and hate. I think that might be a little bit of a weird translation in there, but yeah, we're too busy with our own lives and worrying about what's going on in order to, you know, why would someone hate someone in, you know, some weird far off country that they never even heard of if politicians and the news media weren't filling their noggins with all this crap? So the vast majority may not be good for the viewing figures, nor do they provide material for international bestsellers with which you win the Nobel Prize in Literature. But that majority makes this life on Earth worth living. Years later, one of the boys in Sharif's second experiment marveled at how distorted our view of man is. The experiment had taught him that friendships grow spontaneously, and it is difficult, very difficult, to disperse friends. Sometimes, I think, he sighed, the rest of the world should hear about this sober fact too. So that's all in this article. I've been looking down beneath this, and it looks like there are some other good articles about this thing. This one I want to read here. I might do a live stream on that, about Stanley Milgram's experiment. This is the one where he had test subjects shock people for getting wrong answers, and they were actors. They weren't really being shocked, but the people who were the test subjects didn't know that. They thought they were delivering electric shocks. And it's all about how, oh, people are willing to, you know, to hurt others, you know, just to help them learn, or how easily they obey authority. And the reality of it doesn't quite match. Like with the Robbers Cave experiment, the reality doesn't quite match what everyone says. But it's part of a collection, The Good in Man. So I thought I'd make you aware of this and kind of encourage you to read up on more of the details of the Robbers Cave experiment. Just all the stuff they had to do to get those two groups of boys against each other. It was a lot, but it's also the same kind of thing that's being done to us all the time. You know, this just happened. Like, the Republicans are talking about this stimulus package where everybody gets a check. I think each adult was going to get $1,200 and $500 for every child or something. And the Democrats just voted that down because, you know, it's time for a plan of our own, and, you know, we need to stop the Republicans, Orange Man bad and everything. It's like, this isn't about helping us through the coronavirus epidemic. This isn't about, this is about them making themselves look good, because it's an election year. Even if it weren't an election year, it would still be about that. But it's just even worse now. And I'm just here as yet another appeal for people to please not fall for that. Most people are good, and over and over and over again, the science confirms that. So, thank you so much for watching this. Until next time, stay strong and be free.